Hi there, welcome to my review of the Nikon Z6. Now before we begin, one of the things I want to say categorically is I love this camera. If I didn't love this camera, I wouldn't be making any commentary about it on YouTube at all. But it's a fantastic camera and I enjoy shooting it a great deal. What I'm going to be doing in this video is presenting some particular things that I think would make video shooting much more enjoyable. And by the way, if you're a photographer who's interested in video, you might be interested in this. If you're a photographer who's only interested in photography, you're probably better off looking at something else, okay? So this is really going to be video centric, and we're going to talk about some of the things I think that the Nikon people can do easily for the most part and can do in firmware to make the Nikon Z6 a much better and more inviting camera for video shooters, and we're going to start right now. The first thing I want to mention is zebras. Zebras should be pretty simple. Basically, it's an exposure tool that tells you exactly what parts of the image are overexposed or higher than the setting that you have. Well, to my shock, I opened it up on the Z6, and when I looked for the exposures, I saw that the top exposure was 256. I said, what the hell is that? 256. That is a Photoshop tool. Anyone who's ever done zebras or used zebras on a Panasonic or a Sony or a Canon or anything else you can name is that the light is gauged off in 100 increments of what they call IREs. Okay? This is a Photoshop thing, and mainly, as far as I've understood, it has to do with how many colors you're shooting at a particular time. Nothing to do with exposure at all. So let me suggest that when you go into the video mode on the Z6, that the Nikon people change this so we can actually use the terminology and the increments that we're all used to shooting on every other camera that exists. The next thing is peaking and zebras. Now, to my shock, something else I've never seen before is that you cannot use peaking for focus and zebras for exposure at the same time. You can only have one or the other. Now, you know, as video shooters, we need constantly to be checking our exposure and constantly be checking our focus if we're shooting in full manual, which is what I do. And we need both these things operative. Is it possible? Is it asking for the moon? I don't think so. It's a possibility on the A7 III, the Sony. It's a possibility on every other Sony camera I've ever shot. It's a possibility on the Panasonics, the GH5, the GH5S, the G85, the G7. All these things will give you peaking and zebras at the same time. And I don't see any reason in the world why Nikon will not include this with the camera, because for video shooters, it's absolutely necessary. Now, it's not necessary for photographers. A photographer gets their exposure, and then they get their focus and snap, and that's it, and then they go on. Well, that's wonderful. But when we start rolling with video, we're in situations where light and other things are changing all the time, and focus, obviously. So we need both these things operative when we're shooting video. That should be obvious, and why it wasn't included, I don't know. The next thing I'd like to talk about, as long as we're talking about focus, is focus check. Now, I have programmed a button on my Z6 that gives me a good focus so I can zoom in real quick, because I shoot manually focus all the time. So I program that button so I can really zoom in there and get good focus and then zoom out. But again, we're talking about video, not photography. Well, what's the difference? The difference is that your focus keeps changing when you're shooting video. In photography, You focus on the thing, it's in focus, and snap, and there's your picture. Okay, super fine. But in video, it doesn't work that way. You get your focus, and then boom, you start rolling, and you're rolling and things change. You might want to focus on something else. You might be panning. You might be doing any number of things, and you might want to check your focus in the midst of all that. But you can't do it, not on a Nikon Z6. That should be, I would think, something simple that could be added to a firmware update. So come on, Nikon, give us a continuous ability to check our focus when we're rolling in video. The next issue I'd like to talk about is this wonderful FTZ mount. I really appreciate this. It enables me to do a lot of things and connect, of course, my old Nikon glass, which I love, on to the FTZ mount. But there is a problem, and the problem is the design of this thing right here on the bottom. Let me see if I can explain. This here is my Nikon Z6. And as you can see, when I shoot a lot of video, instead of relying on the EVF or the LCD, I rely mostly on this Zacuto viewfinder, and it works great. You can shoot out in the sun, no problem. It's wonderful, okay? But if you notice a little closer on this camera, you'll notice that if you got close enough, you would notice that this lens right here is not a Nikon mount or Nikon lens. The reason it's not is because I can't use my Zacuto and mount any Nikons on it, because this thing blocks my ability to do that. So I can't use any Nikon lenses. So what am I doing? I'm shooting FD lenses all the time. All the time. I love my Nikon lenses, but I can't use them. Okay? Now, if Nikon gave us a different design for this that didn't block my ability to mount my Zacuto, then I could use my Nikon lenses, legacy lenses, because I prefer them in many cases to the FD lenses. I mean, both of them are great. I'm not going to complain about Canon and Nikon. You know, they're both really great lenses, but I really love using many of those Nikon legacy lenses, but I can't use them on a Nikon camera. Isn't that ironic? The only place I can use those Nikon lenses is on my Fujifilm, the X-T3 and the XH1, and they work a treat. They're really fantastic. But so sad, because of this stupid design, pardon me, the stupid design, I can't mount them on my Nikon camera. So sad. Can we have a different design for this? The next thing I'm going to talk about is the level meter. Now, Nikon has a very nice level meter. It's really super, and you can toggle it in on the DISP button there, on the display button, and you can toggle over there and get your levels, and that's really great. And that's great for a photographer, right? Then you toggle off of it and you do your shot. But it's not so great for people who do video. I mean, take a look at that level meter. Good gracious. How can you see what you're shooting with that big thing right there in the middle of the screen? Now, Fuji has a really great solution for this. They enable you actually just to simply have a level meter, just a level line that goes right across the screen. So while you're shooting video, which you're again hand holding and you're shooting continuously, you need that level meter up there all the time, working and functioning and telling you exactly how true you're holding the camera. It's very important. Well, you know, I can, while I'm shooting live, I can use that DISP button, and I can switch through and toggle through all these different things while I'm shooting. But unfortunately, I really don't feel that the level meter is really conducive to actually shooting video, because it blocks so much of the screen. So if Nikon could simply give us a good level, that would be great. And just like as you can see, as I'm showing here, as you can see with my Fuji camera, and it works great. It works great. It works on the X-T3. It works on the XH1. And, you know, I really haven't checked Sony or these other people to see if they give level meters like that. But it's a wonderful tool to have, and it's really, really necessary when you're shooting out and about, run and gun, handheld video. So help us, Nikon. Help us to keep our images level on your camera by giving us a proper level tool that we can use. Well, this next thing I'm going to complain about has nothing to do with firmware, but has to do with the hardware of the Nikon Z6. And the hardware I'm speaking of is actually the software, because it is soft. It's the rubber Eyecup of the EVF. Sun leaks into that thing. It's like a sieve as far as light goes. It's terrible. And when you're shooting video and you're shooting handheld and you're shooting manual focus, you've got to be able to see that focus and see it really well. And in bright sunlight, I find this particular EVF to be impossible to use. It's particularly bad. So what I'd recommend is that for Nikon making their own, maybe optional, rubber Eyecup, that would be a great Eyecup that a video person could use to completely cut out the light so that he could actually see focus and exposure and all that very well, because right now it's not possible. And if you could do that, then even with the FTZ adapter as it is, I could use those wonderful Nikon lenses and be able to see in bright sunlight. And that's what I would love to do. In fact, it would make the camera actually lighter. So, or if anyone here, by the way, happens to know of a third-party Eyecup that would be great to use on the Nikon Z6, I'd really appreciate to know, because, you know, when we do these videos, we're just sharing information, and I've tried to share some information with you. So if you know better than I do about a good Eyecup that's going to work on the Z6, please let me know. Moving right along here, I'm going to have to ask, what happened to my exposure meters? Now, if I'm in photography mode, the exposure meter is right there on the side of the screen, and you can see it all the time. Very helpful in gauging exposure. In fact, actually essential. But as soon as I flip into video mode, it's gone. It's completely vanished, and there's nowhere that it can be found. Now, we need to know what our exposure is. The exposure meter is very helpful. Take a look. Here's an exposure meter that I'm that is on the Canon camera that I'm shooting, and here's another exposure meter on the Fuji XH1, and this meter is running, and I'm using a completely non-electronic lens on the front of it, but I'm still getting my exposure in video mode. And then here's a shot of the X-T3, and as you can see, in video mode, there it is, plain as day, right there on the side, the good old exposure meter. Come on, Nikon, give us our exposure meter. We really need it when we're shooting video. It's really, really helpful. The one thing about the exposure meter that's so great is that it's a live meter, that it's not just a one and done meter. You're looking at it all the time, and it's always showing you exactly what your exposure is at that time. It's very useful. So please, in a firmware update, give us this meter. We really, really, really need it. The proper tool, I would suppose, for a photographer, though I'm not one, is, you know, just a regular old generic histogram. And that makes photographers happy. But that's really not the proper tool for a video shooter. The proper tool is the one that I'm showing you here on my XC15 Canon camera. That's called a waveform, and it's basically a histogram flipped over on its side, but it shows you exactly the light distribution from left to right, and it's very, very important to be able to see that to get the best kind of exposure, especially if you're shooting log. But besides that, when you're setting your middle gray and other things like that, the waveform is a wonderful, wonderful tool to have. That's why that cinematic cameras almost all have waveform. In fact, they all have waveform. There's no almost about it. So if it would be possible, when you slip into video mode, when you flip over there in video mode and out of photography mode, instead of the histogram, could we possibly have a waveform? Or, I don't know. No, can we have a waveform? It's that impossible to ask. The XC15 will give you waveforms, will give you zebras, will give you focus peaking, all running at the same time while you're shooting 300 megabits a second video. That's a lot of processing, and that's a small camera. And it's a camera that's also 2 or 3 years old. So, come on, give us some of the proper video tools that we need, and I'll guarantee you, if you give those tools to video shooters, they're going to flock to your camera because everything else about it is just freaking fantastic. All right, well, there's my list, for better or for worse. And, you know, it's hardly an exhaustive list. I'm sure the people watching this video can come up with lots of other things besides this. But I've kept the list limited to just these few things because, first of all, I think these things can be taken care of in firmware. So it shouldn't be anything difficult to do. No hardware is going to be needed. And the other thing is that these are extremely useful tools for exposure and for focus. And we need these tools. We need these tools just as much as a photographer needs those tools, and we need them continually, not just one and done and then snap the photo. No, because we're rolling all the time, we need those things all the time. So Nikon, please, you've made a fantastic camera here, and the things I'm suggesting will just make it more pleasurable and easier to use to get great results for video people. So please work these things into our video here, okay? And you're going to have people flocking to your camera because otherwise, it's fantastic. It's a fantastic camera. I love shooting this camera. Stabilization. I'm not going to go on to the things that are very good because the people who are looking at this know how good the Nikon Z6 is with so many features, image and color and so on and so forth. This video is how to make us able to get those things better. So thank you so much for listening, Nikon. I hope you're listening. And thank you, dear viewer, for listening. I appreciate you giving me the time, and I hope you feel like it was worth it.